Welcome to the Reality Revolution. It is an exciting day on the Reality Revolution podcast. I have Dr. Dawson Church, one of my very favorite writers. I have to admit I'm a little bit nervous, but let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Church. Dr. Church is an award-winning author. He wrote The Genie in Your Genes. It's been hailed as a breakthrough in the field of epigenetics. He has published numerous scientific papers with a focus on remarkable self-healing mechanisms now emerging at the intersection of emotion and gene expression. He applies these breakthroughs to health and athletic performance through EFTuniverse.com, which is one of the largest alternative medicine sites on the web. Dawson was educated at Baylor University and Holos University, where he earned his doctorate under the tuition of Harvard-trained neurosurgeon Norm Shealy, with whom he co-authored Soul Medicine, Awakening Your Inner Blueprint from Abundant Health and Energy, another great book I recommend. Dawson is editor emeritus of the peer-reviewed journal Energy Psychology, Theory, Research, and Treatment, a fantastic journal that you can actually get individual copies of on Amazon. And he founded the nonprofit Soul Medicine Institute to research and train practitioners in energy psychology. Dawson works with business and sports teams to achieve peak performance. He no longer accepts private clients, but instead refers them to certified practitioners at his site, EFT Universe. You can read more about Dawson Church at dawsonchurch.com. One of my very favorite books is Mind to Matter, and the reason it really stands out to me, if I am having a discussion with doubters or people that don't quite understand the idea of reality creation and the effect of the mind and thoughts on consciousness, and they'll say, it's just not true. It's all hooey. They've never really proven that thoughts have an influence on matter. What you're saying is, it's just all ridiculous. I say, no, you need to read this book, Mind to Matter by Dawson Church. It is really well done book, which evaluates a number of different research studies and analysis to show why our thoughts are changing the environment around us in more ways than we can imagine. The stuff that you come up with in this book is profound. And so welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm so excited to have you, Dr. Church.
Brian, it's such a pleasure to be here. And just call me Dawson. Okay. And I'm as excited as you are and everyone else is about this stuff, because when I first got into this, I didn't know there was so much evidence that our thoughts create our reality. So as I traced the science behind it, I became more and more astonished myself. And I just share that enthusiasm and delight in the book. So thank you.
It's easy for us to see examples in our lives when we think thoughts and things start happening. But sometimes it's hard to prove. We can feel it. We know that there's some truth behind it. But then there's always been this division between science and mysticism, as you talk a little bit about. And the scientific community almost doesn't want to believe that, because it would deeply affect a lot of research studies and a lot of things. And on the other hand, what you've done is gone beyond just the specific personal examples and looked at the scientific studies of how thoughts change reality. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So what was the first point in time when you decided to write this book? What was the piece of evidence that really lit you up and said, we need to detail this and go over this some more so people can understand how thoughts can change reality?
That's a great question, Brian. And there were several of those moments during writing the book and reading the research that led to the book that did just completely awe me. Mm-hmm. AWE. Just right. Awesome. And I just read those studies and realized they had profound implications for our worldview and what we regard as the limits of our human potential. And one of the studies that really just struck me forcefully was when I read, I'd heard a couple of accounts about how people could change the way Geiger counters are recording. And so the idea that human beings could shift the rate of radioactive decay was really amazing, because like, for example, in science, people need really accurate timing. They don't just use analog or digital clocks, because those can differ and they aren't always accurate. They can speed up, they can slow down. And so in science, we use atomic clocks. And some of these clocks use a radioactive substance called cesium. And cesium those clocks are accurate to within 1 second every 4 million years. Now that's a highly stable state of radioactive decay.
Right.
You know that substance is decaying by a certain amount, and that amount is so stable, it doesn't change by more than 1 second in 4 million years.
Mm-hmm.
So when I began to read accounts that people could literally speed up or slow down radiation, I was like, radioactive decay, I was just like, that's remarkable. And then I began to find not just mentions of this, but research into this. And one Qigong master, Dr. Zin, who I highlighted in the book, is able to speed up radioactive decay and slow down radioactive decay, basically around 10% in either direction. So here, somebody using consciousness alone, not even touching the sample, is able to do this. And that just blew my mind.
And you actually did an experiment in the book, which was very fascinating. You found a thermometer that you could use a Geiger counter and get an exact reading on. You went into meditation, and then without touching the device, you attempted to increase the readings on it, and for an hour afterwards, the readings were higher. Am I right? Tell me a little bit more. There's a picture in the book. You're super excited, and to me too, that was like, a lot of the research is good, but this is a very specific example that is incontrovertible, that you had changed the radioactive decay for this thing in your thermometer. Did you want to mention that a little?
Yeah, and so after I read that research and traced a number of studies like that, I tried to interest various colleagues in replicating that experiment, because I wanted to see if replications would yield that same ability to both slow down and speed up radioactive decay. And for whatever reason, the people I talked to, they had other research projects going. It was going to be years before they could get to it. They weren't that interested. So I thought, well, it's not that hard to do. You just order a Geiger counter, digital Geiger counter, and you order an ordinary smoke detector. Smoke detectors have this thing called americium in them, and this little tiny little pellet, like the size of the head of a pin, of radioactive substance. Its radiation is so weak that even if you hold the Geiger counter an inch or two away, it picks up nothing. You have to be right on the americium for it to have an effect.
Right.
So the equipment isn't expensive. I ordered it, and I thought, I'll just try this myself. And I tell the story kind of like a stand-up comedian would. I mean, I'm not trying to be all that serious about this experiment. It was kind of a lighthearted prank. But it finally arrived. I set it on the kitchen table. I then held my hands around it and tried to make it change. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't. Nothing happened. I didn't raise or lower the rate of radioactive decay. But then I thought, let me just try and treat this thing as though this were a person I was intending healing toward. So I entered into this meditative state, into this flow state. Now, earlier in the book, I talk about what happens in your brain in a flow state. And very interesting and specific things happen in the brains of people in flow that are very different from the brains of people not in flow. And that is that they become coherent. Your heart rate variability becomes coherent, your brain waves become coherent, and you're in a very different physiological state when you're in flow. So I entered that flow state, and then I simply held my hands around the sample as though it were a person for whom I was intending healing. Right. And lo and behold, the rate of radioactive decay speeded up dramatically when I did that. Then I thought, well, aren't I cool? Let's see if I can slow this thing down now. So I then held the intention, right, I slow it down. And Brian, nothing happened. Yeah. When I tried to slow it down, I only speed it up. Then my wife came home from work, and so she's always my experimental subject of first resort.
Right. I lost your sound. I lost that last bit. The sound went out. So just say that again.
Yeah. So my wife was there, and she's my subject of first resort. She easily gives informed consent. I explained what I was doing. I said, okay, now, darling, you hold your hands around this thing and see what happens. Right. And she tried to speed it up, and nothing happened. But then I said, okay, think of your grandchildren. Now, my wife is a really calm human being. Right. And so when she filled this sphere with love and thought of her grandchildren, she slowed it way down. And it turned out that she was incapable of speeding it up that she could quite easily slow it down. I can do just the opposite. So it's just one of those funny moments when you realize that, hey, we're having a much bigger effect on reality than we realize.
Well, you mentioned something, and we could go off on this for a long time, but I'm fascinated by it. You mentioned that when the heart and mind kind of go into coherence, you've actually been involved in some studies with Dr. Joe Dispenza where you evaluate people going into coherence and then the effects of that. I think there's an interesting correlation. It seems like we are able to influence with our thoughts more effectively, according to Lynn McTaggart's research also identifies that as well, and your book as well, that there's something that seems to happen when the heart and mind are in coherence. I've had some episodes about this. You also have a terrific story in the book at the beginning where you're working on your first book and you go out and something that sounds exactly like what I would do. You throw your keys in in your jacket and you jump in the water in the ocean in Hawaii, and you lose your keys. I mean, in the ocean. So, of course, if that happened to most of us, we would be freaking out because you're in Hawaii, you're not, and you got to get these keys. But you, in your example, you relaxed and you focused. You made it a point to say that you focused on your heart when this happened. And then you looked around the beach, and then you found some people, and there was I believe a kid and his father, and you asked him, just something in your mind said, I need to ask, did you find anything when you were out in the water? And the kid pulled up some keys. Yep. I'm sorry to tell your story. I'm super nervous, and I'm definitely talking too much, but I wanted to talk about that because it was interesting, because your first thought in that moment, it wasn't to just visualize or to pray. It was to focus on your heart. So, and all of these great writers have talked about the heart, and it's becoming more and more. Is the heart? The heart is thinking too. The heart, in conjunction with the mind, seems to have greater power. And I would love to talk with you about that. You've actually been on the forefront of some research about this.
Yeah, the heart's field is thousands of times stronger than the brain's field. And so the heart literally entrains the brain. When you go into heart coherence and your heart rate variability comes to coherence, it triggers brain coherence. And the crucial question, Brian, I was trying to answer here was, what is the difference between the person who has good intentions and really has aspirations, does visualization, does affirmation, and nothing happens?
What's the difference?
And the person who is a super manifestor, people who visualize something and it manifests. What is the difference between person A and person B? And I know lots of people who are fabulous manifestors, like Joe Dispenza. I mean, if he has an intention, it's going to happen. Jack Canfield, many of these people, once they have an intention, it's really likely to happen. But then I know people like my friend Sally. And Sally has beautiful visions for her life, for her relationship, for her children, for the world, and nothing she intends ever happens. And I said, what's the difference between Joe and Sally? And so that was like this question I was about almost done writing the book, and I began to try and figure that out. I said, what is the difference between a Joe and a Sally? We all know people who are like Sally, who have high aspirations, and their visions just fall flat. And then there are people who are really clear in their aspirations, and their aspirations happen. What is the difference between Joe and Sally?
Exactly.
And the surprising answer I discovered was coherence. That Joe is meditating. Often Joe meditates for 2 hours a day. People like, I was talking to one of my friends, Kyle Cease, who's a comedian. He meditates for more than 2 hours a day. And you don't need to meditate that long, but you need to get into these really deep states of flow. What happens then is the heart is coherent and the brain is coherent together. And that's when intentions, when they are expressed, when they are formulated in that state of coherence, that's when they have impact. And one of the other studies in the book that really just blew my mind was done by my friend Roland McCready at HeartMath. And he had people intend again that the DNA in a beaker, a sealed beaker, change in its molecular structure. And with an advanced spectrometer, you can measure how tightly twisted those coils of DNA are in a sample. And so this was human DNA in a beaker. And the instruction to the people doing the intending was, I want you to intend that DNA twist tighter. And so they intended that, and nothing happened. But then they went into heart coherence. and people would go into this deep state of flow and heart coherence, in which you bring your brain into coherence. When they then had that intention, the DNA did indeed twist tighter. So then the heart math experimenter said, okay, let's make this a little more complicated. Let's have 3 beakers of DNA, and we want you to twist the DNA tighter in only the right-hand side beaker and leave the central beaker and the left beaker unchanged. And that's exactly what happened. They were able to produce that effect. Then the experimenter said, okay, let's make this more difficult still. Let's move these 3 beakers into the next room where you can't even see them. And they were still able to produce the effect. And then they said, okay, now let's have you untwist the molecules in only the middle beaker, but not the 2 side ones. And that happened. And the final experiment was they moved the 3 beakers 50 miles away. And again, those people in heart coherence could still do that. Now that's just mind-blowing. That's how human consciousness was literally, when it was in this coherent state, able to affect human DNA at a distance of 50 miles. If that doesn't make you think, I don't know what will.
Unbelievable. So when you say coherence, let's go into that a little further. Scientifically, when you see somebody that's coherent, what are you seeing? Is there a reading? Is the heart beating? What does that mean scientifically if I'm looking at EEG or however you define it? When you know somebody's for sure in coherence, what are the signs?
Yeah, you can see coherence on EEG very easily on an MRI and also on a heart coherence monitor.
Right.
And so if you think about a typical EEG readout, and there are many of these in the book, you see all of the brain waves and they're all moving in sync. So it's like an army, all marching in step. And that's what your brain waves look like when you're in that coherent state. And the example I give is a laser. So I showed a little image of a laser and also an incandescent bulb. Now, an incandescent bulb, 60 watts, is very useful. It's putting out non-coherent light. That light is not in phase, not in step. But you can illuminate your room. You can turn on your car headlights. And even in that state of not being in coherence, light is very useful if there's 60 watts of it. But if you put that same 60 watts of light in phase, it's a laser. And that laser, that 60 watt laser, can cut through a steel plate. It's much more powerful in phase. Right. And so that's what your brain waves look like. They're in the state of coherence.
So is it the beat of the heart in conjunction with the wave of the brainwave?
Yeah.
Okay.
Both your heart and your brain are in sync.
Wow. So have you, since you've been studying, is there a shortcut? Of course, I know I can go and meditate for 2 hours, and I've done that. But is there a shortcut? Hey, I want to connect my heart and mind in the next 5 minutes. Is there a shortcut that maybe scientifically that you've seen effective?
You can do it right now. You can do it easily. Now, when I first learned to do it with heart math, I used their heart coherence monitor, that little device called the M-Wave. Now that same technology is available on your smartphone. You can do heart coherence on your smartphone. But a way of doing it without any tech at all is to simply slow your breathing down to 6 seconds per in-breath and 6 seconds per out-breath. That automatically puts you into heart coherence.
Oh, okay. That is great to know, because I know a lot of people out there want to understand how to get into heart coherence. They understand the theory of it, but so let's just play around with these ideas. Now we know fundamentally that consciousness can change and have an effect on reality. Do you think that there is a coherence that can happen with groups of people, with more than one person having similar thoughts? Can independent structures start to form and exist that are even more powerful, that when multiple people are thinking similar thoughts, is it possible that we can start to see effects from that?
Yeah, and that happens in various dimensions. One is resonance. So if I, for example, have a guitar and I'm in a room where another guitar or a violin or even a piano is being played, I'll feel the strings on my guitar vibrate without me plucking them. That's just because of the resonance that's coming through the airwaves. And there's a phenomenon called emotional contagion that's been measured. And emotional contagion is that when you are with people, you can pick up their feelings, even at a distance. And so if, for example, there is a healer and a healee in the same room, that the healer goes into heart coherence, that will tend to put the healee in heart coherence as well. And then people who are exuberant, people who have elevated emotional tone, people who are happy, they're having an effect on those all around them. And there's this long-running study that's been running since the 1960s called the Framingham Heart Study. Mm-hmm. I talk about this in chapter 2 of Mind to Matter. And in that Framingham Heart Study, they looked at the ability of people to produce emotional contagion in each other. And it turns out that if you're happy, your next door neighbor is around a third more likely to be happy. And so, for example, if you have a person who moves into a house and that person is a happy person, the neighbors will tend to get about 34% happier. Not only that, they'll make people around them around 15% happier, and the people around them, 3 layers out, will be around 9% happier.
Oh,
so
wow.
Emotional contagion all around us all the time. And then at the end of Mind to Matter, in chapters 5 and 6, I talk about this on a global scale. And this is really amazing.
It is.
And in this piece of research done by HeartMath, they were looking at human coherence. And they found that when they took the heart rate variability and the coherence plan, the coherence assessment of a person in the state for a whole month, 1 full month, and they mapped that against solar activity, solar flares, and the way solar flares affect the Earth's field, they found again that coherent match. The two graphs were pretty much in sympathy with each other. Somebody not in heart coherence, no effect. But that person in heart coherence is then in coherence with these huge solar system-wide cycles. Now, what that also means, and this is my huge insight as I was writing the end of the book, if I am in coherence with these huge geomagnetic pulses that are affecting the entire solar system and in turn the whole universe, then I am automatically also in coherence, in sync with everyone else who's in coherence. Because if I'm in coherence here in California, then if somebody else is in coherence in Sydney, Australia, or Beijing, China, then we're all in coherence together. So this is one of the first ways in which we can now begin to have a scientific explanation for distant healing, for clairvoyance, for telepathy, all of these phenomena that seemed so mysterious earlier. We're now beginning to realize that coherence may play a role in all of these phenomena, and that this may in fact be happening on a global scale. So HeartMath has what's called the Global Coherence Project, where they're tracking this. Just for example, another example I use in Mind to Matter is that there are random number generators in various parts of the planet's surface, and these just run and they generate random strings of ones and zeros. And so because it's a random number generator and it's designed to be that way, it should be totally random all the time, but it isn't. During, for example, big global events like 9/11, those random number generators are not random. During huge peace rallies like the Women's March 2.5, 3 years ago, those random number generators suddenly all over the world, they're not producing random numbers anymore. And so there are all kinds of ways in which we can show that human consciousness is interacting in these large-scale events to literally shape the world around us.
And that's one of the wonderful conclusions that I got from the book, is this real hope for the future. If we have an understanding of this coherence, as you say in the afterword in the book, we can use this. It's real hope. We can use this to change the world. And it's a message that I love, and you really establish. So this just, my thoughts go off a little bit when we start talking about and the power of all of these large energy. It kind of somewhat validates like astrology. I mean, maybe the effect of planets and other things. I mean, we may never know, but clearly the solar flares are an influence. But do you think that there could be other additional energies, and have they studied those? Have they started to study these energies? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, and there are several of them that they identify. One is called the Schumann frequencies.
Right.
And the Schumann frequencies are the basic pulse of the Earth. They were predicted by a German scientist called Schumann many decades before they were discovered. But they found that the Earth has its own heartbeat, if you want to call it that.
Oh, wow.
And that heartbeat is a consistent 7.8 cycles per second. So roughly 8 times every second, there is this Schumann resonance, the Schumann pulse, passing through the entire planet. And it turns out that when healers are studied, and they are in that healing space, their brain waves come into a high degree of coherence around 7.8 hertz, the same frequency of the Earth. So they may in fact be then recruiting planetary energy in the process. And that 7.8 hertz cycle and frequency is found in the brains of healers, regardless of whether they're shamanic healers, Qigong healers, Christian Pentecostal faith healers, healing touch practitioners. All these kinds of healers come into that same kind of resonance. I was working with a famous healer a few weeks ago called Eric Pearl, who's a close friend, hooked him up to an EEG and looked at his brain waves, and it was amazing what's going on in Eric's brain when he's in that healing space. He is in this state of coherence, and he comes into that frequency. But he's really good at it. I hooked up some of his students, and they were okay at it. He himself was brilliant at this. So we're now hooking people up to EEGs, and we're actually reverse engineering how they function. And then once we do that, we can then train people into doing this. So, for example, I take people away to a retreat every year around Christmas, New Year's, and for 7 days we park them in a meditation room. They then learn to go into deep coherence, and so they're in this deep state of coherence by day 3. So much so that their eyes are open, and from their brain waves, you think they were in deep meditation, but their eyes are open, they're walking around, they're talking like you and I are doing now, and they're in this deep state. So from there, during the retreat, we then have them move into connection with what we call non-local mind. Now, most of the time, we're stuck in our local sense of reality. I'm focused on driving my car and what I'm going to wear today and who I'm going to meet and how many emails are in my inbox, way too many. Looking at myself now on the monitor and realizing I'm way overdue for a haircut. This is all the obsession with the local self. This is all local mind. Me, the me show, okay? Right. So what happens, though, in deep meditation and in heart coherence is that the 2 parts of the brain that construct the self, and those parts also are often worried and suffering. They're part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex in the back of the brain over here. Those are the axes of the self. What happens in these deep states is those parts of the brain have a dramatic degree of shutdown. Now I'm no longer obsessed with my local reality, my local identity, my local self. I then surrender and merge with non-local reality. So in the beginning of Mind to Matter, at the end of Mind to Matter, I talk about this act of surrendering to non-local reality. When you then start to vision, create affirmations, have visualizations that you literally download from those levels of reality. Albert Einstein said that is where all great scientific discoveries are made. And even in writing Mind to Matter, I mean, it's packed with 400 studies, but every one of the major insights in that book came from meditation. I was in a deep state. I'd emerged from that state. I'd be thinking thoughts that I do not think at the level of local mind. I was tuning into non-local mind and having these breakthroughs. So when you're downloading, like at our retreats, we're having people download from non-local mind the vision of non-local mind for their lives. You get insights, you get creativity, you get remarkable ideas that you don't get at the level of non-local mind. So I'm encouraging people in Mind to Matter to do that every single morning. Wake up in the morning. You don't need to spend 2 hours, but do spend 15 or 20 minutes. Everybody has 20 minutes. That one change will change your life.
And that really called out to me. One of the interesting things you talk about is how you started to notice by going into nature that you access the non-local mind. And that's one of the things that really stood out to me after I read the book. I was like, I want to go for a hike today? And I'd go and I would start to notice it. I wanted to talk a little bit about that by going out into nature, you even give an example of going to the redwood trees, I think at one point in the book, but and how everything kind of starts working out perfectly with all these little coincidences and synchronicities. So yeah, what do you think that there's a link between forest and nature and the non-local mind? That's an actual physical example of the non-local mind in action, is what you're saying?
Because the universe runs a non-local mind, nature runs a non-local mind.
Right.
The birds and the bees and the trees and the stars don't need brains to be able to do what they do. Many of them are able to do it with very little in the way of neural tissue. Trees have no neural tissue that we know about, yet they're able to do their tree thing and have been doing it for millions of years.
Right.
So the whole of nature runs this way. And in Mind to Matter, I'm very focused on practical things you can do.
Right.
So there's stories of people who did these things in their own lives. There's one woman who had she had been diagnosed with stage 4 uterine cancer. And she basically decided not to get treatment and just go home and die, but die in the best possible way, die in the most comfortable way. And so she would just take long walks in nature every day. And in the book, I have 30 of these practices you can experiment with. But her big one was water and time in nature. She'd lie in the bathtub for hours each day, and she would just visualize that there were healing stars just flitting through her body, just like snow, just moving through her body, and that they were interacting with the cancer cells and like popping the cancer cells. And she'd lie in the bath, and as the water would get colder, she'd let some water out, put some more water in, and she did this for a period of several months. She got her diagnosis in May, and then in November, again, this is terminal stage 4 cancer,
right,
and a prognosis in May of about 6 months to live. She then went back to the hospital in November, 6 months' time. There was no trace of cancer in her body. So it's possible to heal yourself using consciousness. And that doesn't mean that everybody never will need a pill, will never need chemotherapy. Some people do need pills, do need surgery, do need various medications. And it's wonderful. We have all the benefits of modern medicine at our disposal. But I say use energy. Experiment with energy. See what energy can do for you. It can do a huge amount, including, just this week, actually, there was a study published in the journal Psychoneuroimmunology showing that meditation is able to dramatically shift the aging process, for example. So these practices, those 30 practices, like time in nature, meditation, grounding, acupressure, all of these things can have a huge, huge, huge effect both on your health and your longevity. It's
amazing. I'd like to think this out a little bit further. Some physicists talk about the Akashic Record, and Dr. Joe has the wonderful void meditation. This idea that there's this non-local field has information about all possible realities and so much information that's all stuck in this field. Is it an energy? Is it just a field that we're accessing? Or
Yeah, and we become aware of phenomena, and it takes us a while to figure out the how. Right. So, for example, we've known for a long time that humans for centuries have been using acupressure, acupuncture, pranic healing, all kinds of energy healing techniques without us having any idea of how they work. Now, we're beginning to figure out the actual mechanisms of action of those things. And so we can actually measure these fields now. But 100 years ago, we could measure none of those fields. Right. So it takes a while. There's a big lag, sometimes of hundreds of years, between observing that a phenomenon like energy healing works and knowing how it works. And so these large information fields, we are beginning to understand them. But what we are seeing, for example, is that the brain is definitely not the seat of consciousness. The brain is more like a receiver of consciousness from the field and a projector of consciousness out from your body into the environment around you. And so the old model, the old idea in mechanistic, behavioral, reductionistic science was that the idea was that you have a brain, a very complex brain in the case of a human being, and that brain is then creating this thing called mind and consciousness. And you have mind, you have consciousness because of your brain. But there's no scientific validity to that worldview, that proposition. Instead, the brain is more like a receiver of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So the old view, the old mechanistic view that the brain creates consciousness is like saying, well, okay, now I'm listening to this podcast with Brian and Dawson, and I'm listening on my iPad. Therefore, Brian and Dawson must be inside of my iPad creating this broadcast, this podcast now. Right. And that's just absurd, of course. Right. And that's the old view that is still clung to by many scientists, that the brain creates consciousness. But of course, it doesn't. The brain is receiving consciousness from the field. And so just the way that person with that iPad, now it might look to a primitive tribes person, for example, who'd never seen an iPad before, it might look like Brian and Dawson were inside that device. Right. But we know that there is this information field from which the iPad is receiving information and then making it accessible to us in the local sense. In the same way, our brains are receiving information, and we can tune our brains to different places. We can tune our brains to the vibration of fear. There are people. There's a lot to be afraid of nowadays in the world. I mean, there's global warming and climate change, unpredictable weather. There is scarcity of clean water and food. Mm-hmm. There's deforestation in the Amazon. I can just go on rambling about all the stuff that's wrong for a long time. And I know people who tune to National Public Radio, tune to Pacific Radio, and whip themselves into a frenzy of fear every day on all the stuff that's wrong in the world. They're tuning their consciousness to the fear signal. And that is going to really affect your health. A study published this week in Nature found that high adrenaline produced, in the words of the researcher, drastically shortened lifespan, quote unquote. High adrenaline levels produced drastically shortened lifespan. You do not want to wake up in the morning and tune to the information field of panic, of fear, of lack, of all the things that there are to be concerned about in the world. Now, that doesn't mean you're an uncaring person, or you're just an automaton that has no compassion and doesn't want to know about the suffering of your fellow human beings. You do, but you don't want that to be your primary signal. You want to wake up in the morning and make the primary signal, the primary information field you attune to, the field of the love of the universe, the benevolent universe, the kind and caring nature that is making those flowers bloom and those bees make honey. So, you have a choice. Your attention is your most precious possession, because the way you direct it is going to determine which information field you're becoming attuned to. And as you become more and more attuned to the good, to kindness, to compassion, to well-being, to optimism, to hope, if you attune yourself to all of that you are lighting up those neural pathways in your brain, and you're now turning the software of your consciousness into the hardware, the hardwired hardware of your brain. And now you have bigger and bigger and bigger circuits for perceiving kindness, for perceiving the good, for perceiving love, for perceiving compassion. And that becomes the kind of brain you have after a while. In chapter 1 of Mind to Matter, I give the example of Graham Phillips because I wanted to really find a dramatic case history. Mm-hmm. And he did an 8-week mindfulness meditation program. And he had a team of researchers. He was a TV personality, he had a whole TV crew with him. And the first day, as he began his meditation mindfulness program, he had the TV crew with him at Monash University, where he was given this comprehensive suite of tests, and they measured the volume of every single part of his brain, counting the neurons in his brain. Then, after 8 weeks, he went back. And in that 8 weeks, a part of his brain called the dentate gyrus, which is responsible for coordinating emotional regulation among different brain regions, his dentate gyrus grew by 22.8% in just 8 weeks. And that is how quickly the software of mind is building the hardware of your brain. So after a while, you have this very, very different brain inside your head, a much younger brain, a much more engaged brain, a much more resilient brain, and you are a whole different person. So it's powerful as you use this gift of consciousness to attune to those universal information fields of benevolence and kindness and love and well-being. Make that your signal. You're then resonating with everybody else who's in resonance with that and having a radically better life as a result.
So I just want to talk a little bit about your morning routine. I mean, you kind of briefly spoke about it, but somebody with your kind of knowledge that's experimented with this, I love to share and steal morning routines. So you wake up in the morning. What time do you usually wake up?
Around 5:30.
5:30.
Yeah.
And then the first thing that you do when you wake up, what's your standard usual?
Meditate. Meditate first thing, because
right away before you get out of bed, in bed you meditate?
Yeah, I attune to that universal field beforehand, because when you are in, and I have a lot of pictures of brainwaves in the book and what they do,
right.
But when you're in that early state, you have a lot of delta, your slowest wave, and a lot of theta. You have a little bit of alpha as well. And so when you are asleep, your brain has no alpha, very little beta, none of those high frequencies. It's almost all in the two slow frequencies of delta and theta. So you want to stay in that delta theta state and not start thinking. When you think, you go into beta, and beta suppresses theta and delta. Theta and delta are two healing frequencies as well. So if you begin the morning by staying in that drowsy state for a little while, you then are keeping your brain in that state, and you're then building alpha. Now, alpha is then the bridge to your conscious mind frequency of beta. So you gradually move then into delta, theta, alpha, beta state. And that's a really peaceful state. That's the one where you can get out of local mind into non-local mind. Now, number two, Brian.
Right.
I go make a cup of coffee. I love coffee, and I just have coffee every day, and it really makes me alert, makes me awake. So I brush my teeth, have some vitamins, have a cup of coffee, sit there in meditation with my coffee mug, and then just bask in this state I call bliss brain. And I find the reason there's such bliss there is I'm using this routine that I show you in Mind to Matter called eco meditation.
Right.
And it's basically meditation 101 for failed meditators like me, people who can't meditate, people who can't still their mind. Right. You just do these 7 simple physical things, like you breathe in that 6-second rhythm, you relax certain muscles in your body, and do these 7 mechanical things, and then automatically you're in heart coherence. So now you're in coherence, you're in a state of high heart coherence, you feel really good, and then of course there's coffee, there's breathing, you feel wonderful, and so that triggers the secretion of several neurotransmitters and hormones. One of them is oxytocin. You feel this rush of bonding because oxytocin is the hormone that is triggered by bonding. And you're bonding not with another human being, you're bonding with the universe. So now you have lots of oxytocin. Oxytocin triggers the production of 2 neurotransmitters, which are nitric oxide and anandamide. Nitric oxide makes you awake, alert, expands the blood vessels in your brain, and anandamide is called the bliss molecule because it docks with the same receptor sites in your brain as the active ingredient in marijuana, THC.
Okay.
So you have these THC receptors, and anandamide docks with those, and you start to totally bliss out. So you sit there in this blissful state, you're really alert, you feel really wonderful, and you just sit there in bliss brain for a while, and you don't want to go anywhere because it just feels so good. So between page 80 and page 91 of Mind to Matter, I talk a lot about anandamide and how to trigger anandamide in your brain mechanically through meditation. And so I do that in the morning, and then by the time I get to work and talk to my wife and just my work day, I feel just totally wonderful and maintain that as best I can throughout the day.
And you've used accessing these states to do some remarkable things. And I found a unique coincidence. You and I, when I was 45, I took an art class. Next thing you know, I'm doing a bunch of paintings because, and I was also meditating. And so you have a story like that too, where you'd never painted before, right? You started doing some meditations, went to a single art class. Next thing you know, you're doing these incredible art pieces, and you did like 30 pieces of art in a short period of time, right? You can access incredible skills by going into these states of mind. That's what I found also pretty interesting from the book.
Yeah, and in the book, I talk about the effects of this in your outer world. And there is research showing it makes you much more creative, much more productive, and increases your problem-solving ability. Like in one study by DARPA, the Defense Research Agency, they found that people in that flow state, their ability to solve complex problems increases by 490%. That's an almost 5-fold increase in problem-solving ability. So you then go to your work project. So now there's this baffling, complex problem, but you're in flow, you're in this meditative mind. You then bring all of that problem-solving ability to the problems before you, and you're much better at dealing with your life as a result. Yep.
It's amazing. Have you developed an evening routine? And obviously, this morning routine works great, and we're going back into that theta delta state. Is there a recommended evening routine that can also aid us in this process?
I think it's important to get enough sleep and to have high quality sleep, and also to be able to deal with any negative thoughts and dreams. So if I need to, I use EFT acupressure, which is just tapping on 13 acupressure points with your fingertips, and that releases your stress and balances the body's energy system. And I talk about EFT, and again, meditation, time and nature, about 30 of these things in the book. And so at night, I may do some tapping. I may be in that meditative state. I orient myself again to non-local mind before I go to sleep. I just picture myself one with the benevolent universe. I fall asleep that way. If I wake up in the middle of the night, I again attune my mind there automatically, and then I feel calm and peaceful and grateful for having a wonderful life. And so I give thanks. I was thinking today, too, that, it's not like my life is perfect. It's not like when you do this, everything is just perfect in the outside. It's like, for example, my wife and I lost our home in a wildfire 2 years ago, and
so
we had 2 minutes between the time we woke up with the fire rushing over the hill before we drove out through the flames. And so, it's not like, because we're such good meditators, the wildfire bypassed our house. It destroyed 5,300 homes that night, and ours was among them. But we were resilient because we were meditators. We knew how to tap. Many, many years ago, I'm trying to think how many years ago, 28 years ago, I had a child that died. And so, again, having a child that died, some people would just be devastated the rest of their lives. Many people get divorced. Many couples break up. Many people actually have persistent depression after that. And again, I certainly, had a really hard time with my child dying, but again, I was able to overcome that. So you have all kinds of the same stresses that people have in their lives, but when you had that 23% increase in neural tissue in the dentate gyrus, meditation is not just then a state, it's brain cells, and your brain has rewired itself around resilience. So after the fire, my wife and I were resilient. We were able to bounce back really quickly and reconstruct our lives and go on to an even better life than we had before. So it's powerful to use these practices. And at night, what you can do is really focus on attuning your brain and your mind to that benevolent universe, going to sleep that way, having a good night's sleep, waking up feeling refreshed, enthusiastic, and ready to meet the day ahead of you.
I'm so happy that you survived that. I think everybody listening, that's amazing that you, I'm just so happy. That's in California that happened? One of the wildfires in California?
Yeah, it was called the Tubbs Fire. There were two big fires, one in 2017, the Tubbs Fire. 2018 was the Paradise Fire.
Right.
And also claimed many, many, many lives.
I'm just so happy that you got through after. You had warning signs when this happened. You had some part of you that told you to get up. Am I right?
I woke up and
it may be because of your being tuned in and awareness that you were able to get out in time.
Intuitively. And I wrote a story about this for my, I'm the science columnist for Unity Magazine, and I wrote a column about this, and the column's called 12:45 a.m. Mm-hmm. And it was when we woke up. She shook me awake. I looked at the alarm clock, said 12:45 a.m., and then the power went out. And so many of my neighbors, as I talked to them, said they were mysteriously awakened at 12:45 a.m. because the fire was moving at the speed of a football field every 3 seconds. And so unless people knew as it swept through our canyon, they couldn't get out. 22 people did die in the fire. 8 of them died within just 1,000 yards of our home because the fire was moving so quickly. So those that intuitively woke up, those that had some kind of early warning system, our county actually has a system where they send like Amber Alerts to your cell phone and your telephone. And for, I think, I have no idea why, but the people in charge of that system said, if we send those alerts to everyone in the path of the fire, people will panic and the roads will get clogged. So the powers that be decided not to alert people.
Okay.
And so the fire, moving it again, football field every 3 seconds, just swept through the valley, and a lot of people died. But those that woke up, is so uncanny that at 12:45 a.m. people woke up. In another example of that is during the Indonesian tsunami in 2004. There were these remote islanders called the Andaman Islanders who refused contact with any modern civilization. They just refused to have any contact. They live in Indonesia on an island, the Andaman Island, and but they're hostile to the outside world. They have subsistence economy. They live by shooting game with their bows and their blowguns, and these are fierce islanders. So the tsunami came through and wiped out those islands. On the island nearby, the next island, like 10,000 people died. And so the sociologists thought that these Andamans would be completely wiped out. There are only about 400 of these tribes people in existence.
Right.
But eventually the Indonesian government, about 2 weeks later, had a helicopter hovering over the island to see if any of them survived. And they were met by a hail of arrows from these islanders. Eventually they did land, and there were 4 young men dressed in loincloths who came out. And they had one person who spoke Andaman, and they talked to them and said, how many of you are left after the tsunami? And the Andamans said, oh, we're all here. And they're saying, but all your huts are along the beach, and the beaches all got wiped out. And the Andamans said, oh no, that day we all just walked up into the top of the mountains on our island.
Wow.
So the entire tribe walked up to the top of the hill before the tsunami. They knew.
Right.
So what's the difference between those people who are in tune with nature? And that's what we need to be in tune with non-local mind. And then you can sense things like there's a wildfire. You wake up at 12:45 a.m. in time to get out. So it's powerful to live your life in sync with those large natural cycles. And even though there's a wildfire, you tend to be the one who gets out.
So the non-local mind may have, or clearly has, information about the future or possible versions of the future. And maybe just our heart is the one that can sense this. Our mind can't even understand it. But it seems like the non-local mind has information about the future. Would you agree from these examples that you've given?
Yeah, in Mind to Matter, I talk about a famous researcher called Darrell Beam and his studies of precognition, knowing the future, and he's done a whole series of studies showing that, highly convincing studies in different labs all over the world, and they show that people are able to have a sense of the future. Not only that, the heart knows the future before the mind knows the future.
Right.
One set of experiments, researchers flashed at random either an emotionally triggering negative picture on a screen, like a car accident, a car crash, or a positive image like a vase of flowers. And just at random, the computer flashed either a negative or positive image, selected one and flashed it on the screen. Mm-hmm. And the researchers found that the heart registered whether it was positive or negative by getting less or more stressed before the brain did. So the heart was aware of what the negative or positive image was before the brain was. But here's the freaky thing, Brian.
Yeah.
The heart changed its configuration to register the positive and negative signal before the computer at random selected the image.
It's amazing. So I know you're probably aware of the studies that where less people are on trains that have accidents.
Yes.
There's all these people that didn't go into the building in 9/11. They just had a feeling. There's a statistically significant number of people that avoid accidents and may be related to this.
And after 9/11, the New York Police Department, they put out their first count of how many people would have been killed. They said, well, at around 8 a.m., there would have been about 5,500 people in the building. Right. That's our estimate of how many people died. When the eventual estimates came in, it was around 2,000 people. And so in the book, in Mind to Matter, I give the stories of some of those people and the absolutely, completely wacky synchronicities that stopped them from being in the World Trade Center at that time.
So do you think that there's a wave front from the future that the heart is detecting? I mean, obviously, there's no way to for sure know, but it would appear that time is working like a wave, and we're detecting waves from the future, and ones that are particular to us, our heart can be sensitive to.
Yes, and we get better at that ability as we use it more. That's the big message of the book: is meditate, do EFT tapping, use these 30 practices, time and nature, grounding, use these in your life, because the more you use them, the more you develop that brain tissue. Now you have more neural hardware to do all of this stuff with. So as your hardware increases in bulk, you have more of a bigger antenna, as it were, to pick up those signals from the field. And so you want to practice these things. And research shows that in just 8 weeks of practice, you are already building more neural tissue. So it doesn't take long for the process to start. Now, you don't want to stop after 8 weeks. You want to keep on going for 8 months, 8 years, your whole life. But the process does not take a large investment of time, and the effects do not take a long time to show up in your life. You tune to nonlocal mind, you start to feel happier every day. You do it repeatedly, you start to feel much happier, and your whole life is in sync.
It's amazing. You know, I have to agree with Dr. Joe on his assessment of you as a supermind, because the examples that you've just given us with just automatically off the top of your mind are amazing and incredible. And you're obviously somebody that is an information sponge, constantly acquiring. I know that feeling. I know. I see. You're just like me. So I would love to ask. There's some new information that you've accessed recently. Is there some book or study that you've obviously mentioned 3 or 4? But we may be outside of the conversation. Is there something that really has been interesting to you that you'd love to share with the Reality Revolution?
It's been wonderful to me to see how science has been validating spirituality and mystical experience now for the last 100 years. We've developed things like the ability to read heart rate variability, brain waves, and so on. We're now building up a detailed profile of the brain function of meditators. And in my book, Mind to Matter, I call that the awakened mind. It's not my own term. It came much earlier. Buddhism uses it. Right. EEG researchers have used the awakened mind. But I love the way science is validating our ability to do this. So, a friend of mine called Judith Pennington just published a study. And in this study, she hooked up people at one of my retreats with an EEG, and she found that they were able to access these states really quickly. Just the second time they did this 20-minute meditation, already when she compared them to a database of 7,500 EEGs, they were at the top of the scale. So we now are able, using science, to trigger these states really reliably. Before, in millennia ago, it took 10,000 hours of meditation to even begin to get there. Now, I can sit someone down, hook them up to an EEG, and in about 90 seconds, I can have them there. So it's wonderful that science now is validating this. And with Judith's study, which just published a couple of months ago, I was just so pleased to see that she's showing that she says this produces extraordinary brain states. And the other cool thing is she found that significantly they were able to maintain those states with their eyes open. So we don't need to go into the convent or the monastery or the desert or the Himalayas anymore. Stay in your job, stay with your family, stay doing what you're doing, but attune to these elevated states and then express them in your life and feel how good it can feel to live that way, eyes open every day.
Amazing. Well, we're already up. I could probably talk to you for 3 or 4 hours more, and I really hope that you would come back on the show. We've talked about so much. Your book is wonderful. Everybody, Mind to Matter. There's a special right now on Amazon. You can get the book for $1.99, and there's a goal. I want everybody in the reality revolution to help me. Right now, I believe that there is about 590 reviews on this book, and it would really help Dr. Church out if we could get to 1,000 reviews. So please go on, get a copy of his book, leave a review. Even if you've already read it and didn't leave a review, please go and leave a review, because everybody needs to read this book. Everybody needs to read it. It will change the way that you look at the world and give you a better understanding of the how and why. And it will inspire you. It will give you very easy suggestions and examples on how you can change the way that your mind works and the way that you interconnect with the universe. And it's just wonderful. So, Dawson, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're a wonderful writer. It's a real honor that you came on the show, and I can't wait for your next book. Do you have a new one coming soon?
Yeah, in a year, I'm writing a follow-up book called Bliss Brain, and that'll be available in August of next year. And this gets deep into the neurotransmitters and hormones of ecstasy and how these literally reshape your brain. So, yeah.
Or I'm on the list. I'll be reading that as soon as it comes out. I can't wait. So thank you so much. Thank you. And hopefully we'll talk to you again very soon.
It's a joy to share. Thank you so much.